advert we put out. And this is basically the first thing. So we said we want to record the first, the first 30 minutes because a lot of people ask, and it's not the best time zone. There is no such thing as the best time zone around the world. But after half an hour, we will move to sort of another quarter of an hour informal off the record. So if you don't want to be heard or seen, at some point, there's a point where we don't have the camera or the recording on again. And I think with this, I ask Katrin Wolf to introduce herself, and then we'll see.
Yeah, so hi Regan, hi everybody. I'm really happy to see all of you. So Albrecht and me, we like to talk to you about mixed reality and how it can impact well-being and health. And we are happy to have Regan here. She pioneered the area of physical evolution for computer games. She investigated novel ways of understanding players and their experience, but also ways to evaluate game experience. And I will just start with the first question to Regan. So we discussed a bit like our experiences with the lockdown, which I guess most of us experience in harder or softer ways. And during the first lockdown, I thought this is now time for me to become game addicted because, like, you know, adults have kind of issues with gaming and people think it's a waste of time. You actually burn time. So is like the pandemic, does it influence the perception of games? Does it change the way people games, or do other people play than before? Regan, this is
yeah.
like
Thanks.
a package of questions. But,
yeah, no, that's actually a tricky one to start with, but thank you. And thanks for having me here. I'm very pleased to be here. So just for those of you who don't know me, I do a lot of work in digital gaming and in the context of mental health and social and emotional well-being. I also work with augmented reality and virtual reality, and I used to do more mixed reality work, but have since kind of moved away from that a little bit just to make more time for the mental health work that I do. So to the question, it's actually a fascinating time to be looking at how digital games are used to self-manage our emotional and mental well-being. One thing that I always like to tell people when I talk about this is that there's nothing that's inherently good or bad about games. Games are not good, they're not evil. They do both benefit people and also harm people. It's really kind of whether they provide value or harm is really a function of the context that the player is in. So if you're a healthy person with a balanced lifestyle and gaming is a part of that, it can do wonderful things for you. It can help you relax. It can help you recover from stress. It can help you connect with others socially. But if you're somebody who's having trouble satisfying kind of their basic needs in life, feeling connected to others, struggling with feeling control over your circumstances, feeling like you're not contributing to the world in any meaningful way, then gaming can actually be a harmful pastime in there. So to go back to the question about lockdown or quarantine, it's actually, the answer is like everything else, it depends. So for someone like yourself, or for me, I started gaming much more during quarantine as a time to really help connect to others, as a way to reach out and connect with others. I don't have a lot of time to game normally. And so I started playing a little bit more during quarantine. And I think that was very beneficial for me. But I think for a lot of people who were struggling with lockdown, who were very stressed, who were very isolated, and turned to games as a way to pass the time, that might not have been as beneficial to their overall well-being as those who were using them maybe more socially to reach out to others. I could talk about this for an hour and a half. But
I think I jump in here, and I think just one remark I forgot at the beginning. If you have questions, just put keywords into the chat, and then we can ask you to put it in voice, or just type the whole question, and we'll try to read some of them later. So, for me, one question which I'm really struggling with is what can computer scientists really?
Sorry, Albrecht, you're mute.
Your mic is off.
Okay, so sorry. So what can computer scientists really contribute to this space? So I think we see at the moment there's a lot of research going on, published at conferences like CHI, where computer scientists talk about health, talk about mental health. And I think it's things that have been studied by other fields. People get a really long training. And now we basically play a little bit around with some devices, get some VR headsets on people. And here we are sort of rescuing the world. What is your take on it? What do our students, what do we need to learn in order to really make serious contributions and not just sort of pretend contributions?
That is a really insightful question, and it's something that I've struggled with a lot recently myself. I feel sometimes like if I have to review another paper of a technologist coming up with a system that they thought was a good idea, and then throwing in some words that are kind of therapeutic in nature, that it's going to take us backwards, not forwards as a field. And I think that the answer, unfortunately, is something that's really hard. I feel, and there's two bits to it. I think that interdisciplinary collaboration is really like an overarching answer to this problem. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at depression, anxiety, social health, physical health. We're not the experts on those things. We may know a lot about them, but we're not the experts in those the same way that someone who's trained in that field is an expert. But it's really hard to do. I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, and it's really hard to do. I think a lot of you are trying as well to work with people from very different fields, and it's not just that the language is different, but the entire approach is different. So when we look at mental health, one of the things I've struggled with collaborating with practitioners or with psychologists or psychiatrists in particular, is that I'm trying to think of things that will really push things forward. I want to innovate. I want to invent new and genuine solutions that actually work. And I think a lot of practitioners are really focused on the here and now. What can I do for my patient here and now? And trying to bridge that gap has been really challenging. And honestly, I've got some great collaborators in this mental health space, and most of them are in Germany. And I work with several psychiatrists and clinical psychologists in Germany, simply because I found them, my collaborators there, to be very open to the idea of kind of scientific advancement in this field. But genuine interdisciplinary collaboration is just so hard. I think the other thing that I'd like to mention, I guess, is that there are a lot of ways that we can improve mental health outside of the clinical context. And I think that people in our field of HCI and technology in general have a lot to contribute to this space. So emotional self-regulation or connecting with others. The entire field of CSCW was at one point about building technologies to help people communicate with each other, mediated by technology. And I think that we still have a lot to contribute in this space, and that will have an impact on our health and on our well-being without us needing to kind of dip into the space that's considered more clinical. And there's lots that we can do in terms of encouraging people, motivating people to connect to others, to get outside, to meditate, to prioritize their own self-care. And these kinds of things don't necessarily require that same deep and genuine interdisciplinary collaboration.
So let me go here a bit deeper, because I think one of the things we sometimes see that people try to make technologies that make us happier. And I think we'll have later in this series of talks something, can social VR make us happy, from Eva Wolfgang, and I've seen her already in the audience. So we're going to talk this. But I think this usually brings me to the question about, are we creating drugs? In a way, basically, you cannot always be happy. And we know this is sort of a tricky part of it. So we have, and you had this keyword, emotion regulation. And I think now talking about VR, we can create whatever environment we want. And at the same time, we know we cannot be happy all the time. And now I think this very dark future, I see a computer scientist sitting behind her desk or his desk and saying, oh, Albrecht should be happy 6.5 hours a day, and 7 hours he should be really sad. And I sort of modulate this nicely over his day, and I create a virtual environment that does that. Are we heading towards this? And I think sadly, I have seen papers not this explicit on this, but very much along these lines like, oh, I tell you when to go outside to be happy. And I think looking back at some of our work, we're not completely out of that way. So how do we do that? It's basically, and I think there is no way of not doing it, because if I create an application, I make you do things. If I create an application which makes you sit 6 hours, you will sit 6 hours. If I create an application that requires you to walk in between, I have an impact over your physical doing, over what you see. And so the question is, how do we get this right? Or is this just a problem we cannot really solve?
Yeah, first, I think that one of the signs of a great researcher is having a thick enough skin to look back at their previous work with a critical lens. So good on you for that. And I would agree with you completely. And I think that two things about that. One was the idea of, should we always be happy? And I hope not. I hope we're not trying to create technologies that will make us happy all the time. If we're because as you mentioned, if our goal is the search for pleasure, like for a hedonic kind of like just pleasurable life, then we lose so much, and we lose so much, search for meaning. Also, we need to sometimes be in a negative state in order to process things. So a lot of traditional therapies are kind of based on, sitting in that negative state, reflecting on that negative state, interpreting that negative state, understanding it, and not just like getting out of it as quickly as you can. So I sure hope that that's not kind of the direction we take. In terms of the nudging, oh, go ahead.
No, please.
The second half of that was really about nudging behavior. And I do agree with you. And I've since moved away from a lot of that work on nudging behavior and trying to motivate people. I did work in the past on motivating people to exercise, or motivating people to self-reflect or whatever. And I've since moved away from it for the reasons that you mentioned. Sometimes it feels very challenging. And I think that the better kind of lens or perspective on or framing all this is to give people the tools to self-manage. So if you feel that you need to be sitting in your sadness and thinking about your sadness and interpreting that sadness and understanding it, give people tools to help with that. But if a person wants to kind of remove themselves and elevate themselves from that space, then give them the tools for that. There was a question in the chat, isn't it the same for music, books, and games? We still often choose something that is sad, makes us sad. Interestingly, that's true for traditional media, music, movies, books, that kind of stuff, where we sometimes choose media that suits our mood as opposed to trying to change our mood. Same's not necessarily true all the time of games. Recent work has shown it's not, there are some very sad games out there. We read books and we watch movies about children dying of cancer, but we don't really play games, even though they're available with the same themes. And we're still trying to unpack why that might be the case. But.
So I think I hand over to Katrin, but I think I have one point in between. I think looking at the most successful enterprises of the last years, it is basically creating happiness. So I think it's not the games. I think I tried again today for a reason I may discuss later when we have the recording of TikTok. And basically, it pulled me in, even sort of, I know about the mechanisms. I sat there and I think a quarter of an hour was gone with no time. And I think it is really designed for the happiness thing. But I hand over to Katrin.
Yeah, so we were wondering about the impact of technology on mental health and how we can measure it. So I assume that I'm most happy if I'm not gaming because do analog things. So that may not count for other people, but if you use also games for measuring health, how would you do this? Or would you propose to use other methods of, measuring the impact of technology on mental health?
A big part of my research program is actually using games to assess, let's say. Measures is a challenging word. Diagnose is a terrible word for a computer scientist to use, but I can use the word assess. So I do a lot of work on using games to assess different mental health states. And that's also a thing that's difficult. So when you say mental health, it's kind of like an umbrella term. but are you talking about a mood that's changeable? Are you talking about kind of a lasting mood that's lasted over days? Or are you talking about something that might be even subclinical or something that's clinical? Like you take depression, for example, or anxiety. I might feel stressed. That's not the same as anxiety. That's not the same as anxiety disorder. That's not the same as, so it's kind of like, what are we trying to actually assess? Like what level of the state are we trying to assess? But I think that you can assess mental health, and this is a good example of where I think that computer scientists can bring a new lens. So the traditional ways for clinicians to assess mental health is to ask a series of questions and then to interview the patients as well. And then also sometimes even to observe them in their environment, and sometimes to interview people that are close to them in their lives. And this is kind of how they come to a diagnosis. Whereas I think we can kind of, we can do some things to maybe kind of increase that flow. So in the end, the clinician can be the one diagnosing, but I think computer scientists can develop assessment tools that help. Some examples that have been kind of deployed more widely are like the assessment of early onset dementia or conditions, cognitive decline that might lead to dementia by watching how people engage with computer games. We've been doing some work on anxiety, depression, and social anxiety. Can we use games to assess these, the onset of these states? In particular, things that are like social anxiety is a great example because its onset generally in adolescence. And it's important to kind of like assess people in adolescence, and games are a great vehicle from which you can assess teenagers and kind of their states.
That's kind of a like follow-up. So I guess it's like commonly known that if we are active, physically active, we are happy. We have probably like, some, I don't know, some hormones, or, we really feel happy. So how can we design for body games, for games that make us moving around? I think we have seen the Kinect ads like years ago, and somehow they didn't make it into our living rooms. So are there other ways? I don't know what happened to Pokemon Go. So how can we become more active using games?
Yeah, great question. So this was basically a huge part of my research program about a decade ago. Most of my work was on using games to encourage physical activity in different ways. And then I went on sabbatical in France and I started kind of traveling around Europe a bit and talking about this work. And people were always a little bit like, what are you talking about? And I was very surprised because just the North American context where cities are built around cars and we have a sedentary problem where people might not get like 1,000 steps a day even under certain circumstances, as opposed to, I think, in the European context where maybe that's not as big of a problem. So people might not be super active, but you're getting kind of more basic levels. And so then I started thinking about how to solve kind of the problems of not enough exercise and decided there were so many other ways to solve the problems of not exercise, changing the built environment, policies like government policies, dealing with transit. Like there's just other ways to encourage people to do physical activity other than through games. Pokemon Go is a great example of something that wasn't intended to increase exercise, but was designed, well, it wasn't actually, it was kind of built on a previous game, but was designed as a mechanic that was interesting in and of itself, and kind of like a side effect is that people exercised. And maybe that's a kind of a design approach that we can be taking as well, designing games or other kinds of persuasive technologies that are intended to be a fun, intrinsically motivating experience that have the side effect of providing us health benefits.
Okay, so I think I have a look into the chat, and I think I will start. There's a person called Christina. Are you happy to just raise your question? I think you had a number of them, and I think it was following along. Are you happy to speak out, or should I read it out?
I can speak. I just don't want to show myself because I kind of feel sad today, so I don't.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Just basically let us know your
question. It's a very fitting talk today. Somehow I can relate to all that was said. So yeah, I had the question that if Ring Fit Adventure is a good example for a game which makes you exercise, because I'm currently using it, because I don't want to go outside right now. I mean, with the whole Corona thingy, and it really helps. And I think that's because it has somehow a nudging component. So you can, if you want to, tell your Switch that it has to make some noises once a day to remind you that you have to exercise. And it also has like a reward system. So if you reach the certain level, you have new exercises and stuff. And I think that this is a good example.
Can you give a just sort of a 1 or 2 sentence explanation about the game for people who don't know it?
Oh, okay. So I think most of you know the Nintendo Switch console, which has these 2 controllers, which you can freely use. A little bit like the Kinect, but somehow better. And in this game, there are a lot of modi you can choose from. One is the adventure mode, where you have like an RPG-like setting where you are running and have to defeat certain little monsters and stuff. And then there are also free exercises where you just do the exercise, which I don't find very appealing because I'm more like of a gamer. So and in this adventure, you try to, I think, save the world by defeating a real difficult boss. And everyone is exercising in this world, and it's very colorful, and you have music and stuff. And I think they designed it really well to encourage you to train. And the exercises are color marked. So there are some for your arms and some for your I don't know, back and so on, and yoga-like exercises. And
So I think that gives a good idea. So we'll let sort of Regan come back on that one.
Yes, and that's that. I think that is a good example. Maybe other people here tried it too and can back me up.
What Christina didn't mention is it has a physical controller, and it's able to tell how good you're performing in exercises.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah, you have this additional ring. That's why it's called Ring Fit Adventure. And if you press it, it somehow can measure this pressure. And it's also challenging to press this ring. And you also can set the difficulty. So sometimes it measures less, and so it's more difficult to achieve points in the game.
Cool. I'm glad that you're finding it enjoyable and that it's working for you to get physical activity during this time where it's harder to go outside. I think that there are lots of examples of games that have been very beneficial for this. So Pokemon Go is one we talked about. There was a time when the Just Dance titles were some of the most popular titles. They weren't intended for physical activity. They were intended as dance games, but they were very popular because they were fun. And so you kind of mentioned a few things there. One is that you're having fun, and another one is that the other part of it, the kind of the more training, the exercise, just the exercise part wasn't that enjoyable for you. So I think that there are design opportunities within this space for sure. And I think a lot of approaches to, I don't like the word gamification, but I'll just use it. So a lot of approaches for gamification have really been focused on kind of, if you know the spectrum of motivation, it goes from amotivation, external regulation, that's where you have things coming, you're motivated by external sources, all the way through 4 different types of kind of intrinsic motivation until you get to the one at the end, which is, intrinsic motivation, where it's like you're doing it because the activity itself is enjoyable, not for other reasons. But there's some ones along the way that are actually really interesting to design for. So my point is that a lot of the gamification approaches have really tried to design from external regulation, points, rewards, streaks, these kind of like external forces. And what's been shown in general is this might work in the short term, but it's not really great for adherence in the long term. This is true for exercise, for applications that are designed for people to journal, to learn new languages, to practice their instruments, to engage with cognitive behavioral therapy. There's this huge kind of attrition and lack of adherence that happens after the first few sessions, and very few people actually complete things over the medium term. So we've been doing a lot of work in looking at how we can actually leverage game approaches to encourage people to sustain their adherence over time. I don't know if Dimi's here, but this is work that Max Burke did, who's now at TUE, and work that Dimi Alexandrovsky, who's at Bremen, did with me. And so we've been kind of looking at how we can kind of maintain adherence over time. And I think that one of the under-designed spaces is kind of designing for this introjected regulation or identified regulation. This idea that I see myself as someone who exercises. I might not exercise, but I see myself as someone who values exercise and who likes to stay healthy. And designing kind of for that space, I think is really underutilized. And I would love to see more interventions kind of target what it would mean to get somebody like that engaged in activity, as opposed to trying to make it like inherently fun, which is really hard to do, or trying to use kind of these really external approaches, external regulation to try and get people, which we know don't work over the long term.
So I jump in here, and we have more questions to come also from the chat. I think one of the questions which we come across is, what happens if now VR and AR is really maturing? So I think this level where we can design games that really blend in with our environment, that are pulling us deeper into a game environment, into not just sort of being sort of part of our environment, but really creating new environments, may have much more power over us. And I think you have done work in both directions. And I think I like that you sort of went a little bit around the gamification term. I think we all liked it 10 years back, and then realized sort of it's sort of a bit, But so for me, is there sort of a new, and I think this links to one of the questions we also sent to you, is basically the future of gaming devices, gaming technologies. Is this sort of something which we'll see in the next years? Let's say the big players bring out AR classes. Will we have like a new generation of games? Like the mobile gaming has taken so much, basically it's so much broader than the traditional gaming. Is this sort of, again, something where a lot of broadening of gaming will happen?
Yeah, I think mobile gaming, like you said, did a great job of bringing in kind of a new population, even a new style of gaming that fits into the gaps in our life, as opposed to being kind of these sessions where we would sit and get immersed. A new goal, like it's not just about kind of this achieving this flow state, but it's actually something else. In terms of new technologies, I find that really challenging. So I've done work, I did my master's work in VR in the 90s. And I've been working with VR and AR ever since. I did my PhD in effective computing. So I strapped people up to physiological sensors and actually used them as input in different projects that I did, where we controlled the game through your emotions or through your physiological state. I've done neurofeedback games. I did one with Anka, who's on the call here, where we looked at how we can actually help people to self-regulate their focus and attention using like measuring your EEG activity and using that as input to the game. I've looked at different ways of integrating these into games, and I'm still not someone who would go out there and say, this is the future of gaming, is this technology. And I'm holding out for VR. Like I'm unconvinced. I'm unconvinced about VR right now still, for two reasons. One, cyber sickness is still an unsolved problem, so it excludes a lot of people. But also I think that there's this idea with games that you willingly suspend your disbelief, that you choose to engage in the game environment, that you choose to submit to these like virtual worlds or stories or narratives or characters that don't really make sense and you don't know, but you're choosing to submit to the experience, and just you're like, okay, fine, this is just how it is. It's like watching Star Trek. It's like, okay, they can walk through walls, but they don't fall through floors. Yeah, okay, I'm on board. I'm on board with how this works. Whereas VR seems to be more like, instead of willingly asking players to suspend their disbelief, it's more about like bombing them into submission by taking out everything else that's there. But I do think like social VR for me is, I don't work on it myself, but I know people who do, and I'm always excited when I hear them speak. And I'm sure many of you here I know that many of you here are doing social VR work. And I find that really exciting because I think it opens up new design opportunities, even like in all sorts of areas. And you think even like, this whole like we're talking about physical activity, the Peloton craze, like where I don't know how many of you do Peloton, like it's a biking where you kind of bike with other people and you have a little screen and stuff. And people are super into it because it's, social engagement is a huge pull. Collaboration, competition, doesn't really matter. Socializing with others is one of our basic needs as humans, to feel like we belong and to interact with others. And I think, so social VR has great opportunities. AR, interesting. Like, I guess some of you here are working on AR as well. I've been doing a little bit of work with AR, but because I don't really prototype new hardware, I'm still sort of always just waiting for somebody to come out with some better glasses that actually work for the kinds of applications that we kind of build in the lab, but actually want to try in the world. I think there are huge possibilities for both VR therapy and AR therapy in the context of mental health. Huge, huge design space. And I'm really excited to see all the work that keeps coming out in that. And I'm sure many of you here are doing it. I think being able to have a kind of like a therapist engage with you in the wild, in your context, in an AR, through AR opens up huge opportunities for treatment, and same with VR. VR has been used for a long time for exposure therapy for lots of phobias, and I think that there are even more opportunities. And I know that there's this big new grant in Denmark around social VR for exposure therapy for social anxiety, for example. So I think there's lots of opportunities there.
I'd like to jump in. If you believe in social VR, we discussed a bit the possibilities maybe of future games having also crowdsourcing. So game as a purpose, game as, a possibility to work and to probably earn money, to, have a virtual reality that is not kind of a fairy tale, but more of reality. Do you think that would be possible?
Yeah, so you're talking about like data gathering through games?
Yeah, like having like something like Amazon Mechanical Turk, having a game, like a gamification of something that creates value, like,
sure,
images or surveying, I don't know, airports. I'm just reading a book from Neil Stimson, who completed